If you had told me that a From Software title that is primarily focused on the multiplayer experience, that also happens to be a role-based hero type of game with characters having abilities, ultimates, and everything, while also at the same time being a survival roguelite, and then to top it all off, it's based off of the Elden Ring IP, I would have thought you would have lost your mind. But as it turns out, during the 2024 Game Awards, we were introduced to our first glimpse at a new experimental project coming out of From Software, and this was Elden Ring Nightreign. It's been almost exactly a year since this moment, and now the Nightreign Forsaken Hollows DLC has finally released, yet somehow I am still left with the feeling of wanting more. At the risk of trying not to sound like an entitled baby throughout this entire video, I do want to mention that Elden Ring Nightreign, as it relates to the games industry this year, has been my personal pick for Game of the Year. I mean, I have gotten so much fun and so much value out of a game that is not even full price, and even with the price of the DLC included, still does not reach the cost of a normal game in the industry today. Elden Ring Nightreign was priced as a $40 game, and that makes sense considering the fact that it is certainly not the same scope and scale as the main game of Elden Ring. It uses a lot of these same mechanics, enemies, and even weapons. So to some degree, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. You could see this game as them recycling old content into a new and strange format, or you could look at this as a genuine innovation and them to experiment to push the genre forward and what this studio is capable of. But regardless of whatever personal viewpoint you had on the game, I think we can all agree that it would be in poor taste for From Software to charge the full price of a brand new standard game for a IP that is already existing and a game that is smaller scale and uses all of the base layer mechanics from that prior game. It makes sense to charge less for it. With that being said, we know that Nightreign was extremely experimental and coming from a very small team inside of From Software, in fact, not even primarily directed by Miyazaki at all. But as From Software has built up this layer of trust with its audience over the years, they tend to severely underpromise and overdeliver, and I would say that was absolutely the case with the base game of Nightreign. I mean, I was shocked at just how much that a game that is not full price ended up providing in terms of sheer content and replayability and quality of content as well. For $40, we had a brand new game with our 8 Nightfarers, 8 brand new Nightlords, and a ton of interesting roguelike mechanics that had never really been, utilized before using the Elden Ring IP. I've made my review of the base game already, and while it's certainly not perfect, I will say that Nightreign, I believe, is an absolutely outstanding game, but it's mostly carried on the fact that it is the Souls mechanics and the fact that Elden Ring's bosses and enemies are so brilliantly designed. That's what really, elevates the game beyond a lot of other roguelites. The roguelike elements are actually on the weaker side, all things considered. And I had said that in my initial review, the roguelike elements could certainly use some work, but at the same time, they don't need to go overboard because then that would severely take away from the emphasis of Elden Ring's core combat that is so part and parcel of the main game, and honestly what makes it special in a lot of ways. So I don't want them to go too overboard with the roguelike elements, but there are a lot of ways in which it could be improved, which I talked about in that prior video. But now, what I really want to focus on is the DLC, because I have very conflicting feelings about this. I want to make it very clear that I completely understand that this is a very small team working at From Software on Nightreign, and they probably don't have the budget and resources for a lot of the stuff that they want to do with Nightreign, but really, that's kind of emblematic of my whole problem with this game. In my initial review, I had praised how much it was interesting to be able to play against, old Dark Souls bosses and have them integrated in a way that makes sense into Elden Ring's combat as it's evolved over the years. And I just wanted to see more of that stuff. And I think many people, after experiencing their first set of Dark Souls bosses and these enemies being integrated into the Elden Ring combat loop, just wanted to see more of that. We wanted to have different variations of more Dark Dark Souls enemies that could appear at nighttime. And I mean, there's almost infinite potential there because there are so many enemies that really are proof of concept that could work for this game. I mean, we have the Nameless King, right? We've got the Smelter Demon in Dark Souls 2. We have things from all over the place, but there just really aren't a whole lot of them. In fact, you start to realize that after, a couple hundred hours, if you make it that far, that you play a lot of the same seeds over and over again. A seed is basically a randomized generation of what your world is going to look like, the POIs, the bosses you face, and so on, meaning you play the game enough, you're going to run into the same seeds, which provide the exact same experience as a prior run, which really is the antithesis to the point of a roguelike to begin with. Boiled down, I think this was a lot of people's main gripes with Nightreign. It wasn't the fact that it's a multiplayer game, because in that capacity, it works fairly well, minus the fact that there aren't great tools for communication. We kind of had to develop our own language, which is also fun in its own right, or even the fact that characters have abilities and ultimates, which, sounds like something that like modern slop games do, which, From Software has done a good job at avoiding, falling prey to those trends, but at the same time, they've integrated those ideas in a way that absolutely work for the context of Nightreign. And in some ways, that's kind of a miracle because they were able to integrate these very scary ideas for, a From Software game, multiplayer, hero-based abilities, ultimates. These all sound like very strange for this studio, but miraculously, it really all works. The core gameplay is super solid and incredibly fun, and I have really no problems with the core gameplay from a big picture perspective. But the main problem that I have, and I think a lot of people do have with Nightreign from a big picture standpoint, is the fact that it's just got a lot of wasted potential. It's very easy to use your imagination and just think about what Nightreign could be with a couple of changes and some additions of other enemies, more randomized seeds, and other events that could occur in your game that are completely unexpected and make for incredibly engaging gameplay scenarios. So you can imagine my and many others' anticipation before the DLC came out, and we wanted to know everything about it and what it would bring to the game. And I think, given the standard of a $40 game, and what we got out of it was 8 Nightfarers, 8 Nightlords, we could reasonably expect that for a $15 DLC, we should get some new Nightfarers and new Nightlords. I was predicting around 1 to 2 new Nightfarers and maybe 3 to 4 new Nightlords. That seemed reasonable to me, and maybe that was over-expecting in a way, and I also thought that we would be getting some of the Shadow of the Erdtree weapons, if not the entire roster, because they had already been made at that point, and it feels like a seamless transition to be able to add those in, and would provide infinite replay value to the base game as well. And the Deathly Hallows has released, and as it turns out, what I predicted was not exactly the case, and I think most of my biggest problems with this is its integration into the main game and really what it does come with. We got 2 new Nightfarers, this being the Scholar and also Undertaker. Scholar is a really interesting character theoretically. He's actually very powerful. He can be one of the strongest members on a team, and you can actually do crazy things with him, but he's just not my personal play style. It's similar to Guardian, where I don't really play him hardly ever. I don't think I'm going to play Scholar a whole lot, just because it's not a play style that I personally enjoy, although I can absolutely see his utility on a team and otherwise. But really, the star of the show is Undertaker. I think this has really become everybody's favorite of the DLC, and is now my personal favorite character in the entire game. So 2 new Nightfarers are obviously a very welcome addition, and we have 2 new Nightlords plus a new Shifting Earth. That all sounds like reasonable for $15, and especially compared to what the base game was, that's not too bad. And for what it's worth, the actual DLC Nightlords we got, the Balancers and the Dreglord, are fantastic. They're some of my favorite Nightlords in the entire lineup. You could even argue that we're getting 3 new Nightlords with the DLC, with the inclusion of the Everdark Balancers, which we know are coming at some point. And not to mention, before the DLC came out, we got the addition of a game mode called the Deep of Night, which is essentially a ranked hardcore version of this game, which I have played and grinded all the way to completion of Depth 5. And again, similar to the base game and similar to the DLC, my main problem with Deep of Night is that other than just playing it for the inherent challenge it provides, there are actually no rewards at all for completing this mode and going all the way to the very end. I have completed all of Depth 5. I am rank 999. I've reached the end. You get like these 3 badges on, your level 5 thing. That's really it in terms of rewards. But I had thought that, since the beginning, there was a very easy reward they could have done for players that completed all of Depth 5. I think a phenomenal way to award players for reaching the max Depth 5 should have been given some kind of slot, some kind of, urn that has 6 prismatic relic slots. This would allow you to mix and match literally whatever you have in the game, given that you probably have a lot of relics at this point and not being, held to the confines of certain colors and types. But you should have just been given one that has all prismatic slots. It would have been very easy to integrate and would have been a reward that's worth going after. I don't know why they didn't do this. But to be honest with you, this was my first red flag about the DLC, because given that there's really no rewards for Deep of Night, I was expecting there to be a little bit more maybe saved for the DLC, as it would have been reasonable to maybe paywall some of that content. But when the Forsaken Hollows dropped, other than the 2 Nightlords that we do have, which are both absolutely fantastic, there actually wasn't much else to write home about, and certainly not really anything that affects or enhances the main game, which might be one of the biggest issues. You see, the way the DLC is integrated is quite strange, because once you have the DLC pack, you can play it either from the perspective of a brand new player or somebody who's already played, and regardless if you're a new player or a veteran with hundreds of hours, all you have to do is beat Tricephalos once, which gives you access to the new Nightfarers, so you already have them, and then after you beat the Balancers, which you get access to after beating Gladius, then you can access the Dreglord and then beat him. Now, I think alongside new Nightfarers and Nightlords, many people wanted and expected a new map to come with the DLC, as did I. I think it was reasonable to have a brand new map, as Limveld and the way that it plays, even with its randomized seeds, can get kind of stale, and they would actually drop a new map in the form of a shifting earth called the Great Hollow. Now, you might wonder why they didn't do a brand new map and make it a shifting earth, because in the base game, shifting earths only affect about 1/4 of Limveld, and otherwise it's pretty much the same, but the Great Hollow shifting earth is an entirely brand new map. For all intents and purposes, it is what we were asking for, but you have to access it through a shifting earth, and not to mention, you can only play the Great Hollow while doing either one of the 2 DLC expeditions. You cannot actually play the shifting earth and play any of the base game, which is rather weird. The new map is incredibly interesting. It is downright beautiful, if not a little bit difficult to traverse and comprehend. It plays much differently to Limveld, where it's very horizontal in a way, where the Great Hollows is extraordinarily vertical, and you have to focus a large portion of your run breaking these crystals that release the curse, allowing you to access most of the Day 2 content, like the boss rush towers and otherwise these areas with the best loot. And while the core structure of the gameplay remains the same, to kill as many enemies as quickly as possible to get as much good loot and, high level as you can, the important piece is that the Great Hollows is not merely a reskin of Limfeld, a new coat of paint on the same car, or even a modifier of it, as it is a truly new map with its own unique learning curve and provides a meaningfully different way to experience the game, which is fantastic and honestly all you could really ask for when it comes to wanting a new map. And in that way, they absolutely delivered, as I would also argue they delivered on the new Nightlords and the quality of the Nightfarers themselves. However, I think where the DLC starts to fall apart a little bit for me, or at least show cracks in the armor, is its integration, because not only is it a problem that you can only play the brand new Shifting Earth if you're fighting the one of 2 new Nightlords, like you can't play the Great Hollow Shifting Earth and fight something like the Dark Drift Knight or anything. That will just take you straight back to Limveld. And all of the new POIs that they've added in these new locations for the DLC expeditions, right? These new encampments that have these forges that allow you to re-roll weapon skills. These bring a lot of fresh new gameplay, but even though they're in Limveld, they're only available in the DLC expeditions. I think by and large, my big problem with the DLC is that it doesn't change the base game's experience in any meaningful way. And this leads me to my biggest issue with that, and that is the fact that there are no DLC weapons from Shadow of the Erdtree. And that is despite the fact that in the base game, we have DLC enemies, right? We have the Golden Hippopotamus from that expansion, and in the new expansion, the Forsaken Hollows, Hollows, we have Shadow of the Erdtree enemies like the Curse Blades and, these regular trash mobs from the new map. But the problem is that we don't get any of the new weapons, period. Not a single brand new one from that DLC is in here. And I think this is the biggest pain point. Now, I understand that Ishizaki claimed that Nightreign had a very small budget. And from, the way that game development works at this scale, you typically get a pre-approved budget from your publisher at a certain point, and they probably had a limited budget like years before really any plans were set in stone. And from what they said, Nightreign performed way above their expectations. I don't think that they were even predicting Nightreign to perform as well as it did, meaning that it probably had a certain budget already allocated due to their expectations, and because it completely exceeded that from a business perspective, they were too late to course correct and give them essentially more resources to do more with this game. And I think that's very evident in the fact that we don't have any DLC weapons. And this is quite unfortunate because I love all of the new DLC content. What it does provide is all fantastic. I just wish that it made meaningful changes to the way that the base game functions as well. A very easy fix would be, adding an update to where the new encampments could be experienced in the base game expeditions. That doesn't seem that crazy to me or that out of the ordinary, but would actually add a new way to experience the base game if you've already played it multiple times over and already beaten Deep of Night and all that stuff. Not to mention, as far as the new Nightfarers go, there are no brand new skins or ways to play them at all. That is despite the Deep of Night releasing and the DLC. In fact, the only way to truly experience an altered state of the base game is using one of the new Nightfarers on these expeditions, which, is fair enough. It is fun playing with Undertaker on some of these base game bosses that we've played a lot before, but at the same time, you would expect that having not only a new Nightfarer, but also Shadow of the Erdtree weapons would provide basically infinite replay value, and it doesn't seem like it would be that hard to do, given that there's mods out there that literally do just this. It adds all of the DLC weapons to this game, and you would think that if, these modders can do it, that the actual studio who's making the game can do it. But I also understand that game development is a lot more bureaucratic than we'd like to think. Ishizaki even recently admitted in an interview that they had a lot bigger plans for Nightreign. What they envisioned was a lot more grand than what we have now, or even what the Forsaken Hollows ended up being. And that is just kind of a tragedy because I think their publisher was really not confident in how well that this IP would perform and how good this game would end up doing. And as it obviously overperformed, you would think that that would build up, a lot more trust capital with them and maybe allocate them even more resources for the DLC. And Ishizaki even said that there are currently no plans for more expansions for Nightreign. In fact, it seems like they're actively moving the team off of this game to immediately get on to future projects. As far as we're concerned, it seems like Nightreign is basically over. We've gotten all the content that we're going to get for this game, and I don't believe there's any chance that we're going to see the addition of DLC weapons or even new Nightlords, again, apart from probably Everdark fights that we see. So where does that leave us exactly? This is an open question because Nightreign has genuinely been my favorite game this year, and I can see in my head what this game could have been had it been allocated the proper time, resources, and money and everything to truly see the vision through of what this team had for it. And I'm not really sure why a game that's significantly overperformed did not get any kind of additional support even after the fact of, seeing how well it was doing. The DLC is great, to be honest. The Forsaken Hollows I would absolutely recommend if you are a fan of Nightreign. However, if you're expecting a little something more in the vein of experiencing some of the greatest stuff from Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree, and you want to play against more Dark Souls bosses, honestly, this DLC is maybe not the highest recommendation I could give then. But at the same time, I'm trying to be reasonable about it because I have to sit here and wonder if I expected too much from a $15 DLC. It's really not the most expensive expansion out there, and even the base game with the DLC included, it's still not even the price of a full main game. So to some degree, I want to keep expectations in check, but I also don't think it's crazy to want or assume that we'd be getting weapons that alter the way that the main game plays. The DLC is fantastic, but it's its own self-contained experience that after you've pretty much played through it all at least once, or maybe use the Nightfarers on each of the respective bosses, you're pretty much done, and it doesn't alter the base game in any meaningful way, which new weapons would be be the most straightforward and impactful way to do that. So where do we go from here? Where does From Software take this going forward? What lessons have they learned? I think one of the biggest lessons to learn from this entire situation is to not undersell themselves when they have something truly special. Despite Nightreign being based off an already existing IP and pretty much using a lot of the same content from that game, it was remixed in a way that felt incredibly fresh, and it actually developed a large audience that was sort of unexpected for this. Yet it never really got the resources allocated to this to truly see the vision through to the end and be the grand experience that it could be. What we do have is all fantastic. The new Nightlords make an amazing addition to an already solid base game, but it seems like they significantly undersold themselves and maybe didn't have the confidence they should have in a product like this. However, I prefer to take a more optimistic approach because really what I take away from the Nightreign DLC situation is that if this is what they're providing for the value of a less than full price game and for a project that even they admitted didn't expect to do very well, I can only imagine what kind of refined gameplay and stock that they're putting into their more mainline experiences. I mean, the Duskbloods has been reportedly being worked on since 2019 and is, according to them, one of their most refined gameplay experiences ever. And that's very exciting. And if it ends up being the price of a fully fledged game, then I can only imagine what that's going to look like if they consider Nightreign and its DLC not even what would be a standard game. So either way, I do think Nightreign had a lot of value that, is still present there, but could have been so much more, not only from its conception as a base game, but its DLC could have done so much more for the content that is already provided. And it seems incredibly wasteful to not use the DLC weapons that are already built and assumingly functional to be, implemented into this game. It's unfortunate, and I know for sure that Ishizaki and the team would add those things if they could. There's a lot that they want to do with Nightreign that for one reason or another are just not possible from a resources or a time or budget perspective. They're just not able to do it. But it's sad because this is truly one of the better games, I think, of this genre, and it's fantastic to play, but it'll never quite reach its full potential.